Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. My name is Deirdre Haskell, and I am the Deputy Director of the Institute. We're physically located at 222 College Street in downtown Toronto, and I take this opportunity to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto and the Fields Institute operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As you may be participating from elsewhere, may we suggest that you research the history of your land using the website nativeland.ca. The Fields Institute is a network of 20 universities, federally funded through NSERC and CIHR, provincially through the Ministry of Colleges and Universities and the National Science Foundation of the USA, the Simons Foundation, the principal sponsoring universities, and by individual generous donors. You may already know the Institute through attendance at one of our programs or events. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Fields Institute organizes a wide range of events related to research in the mathematical sciences. One in particular is the Fields Medal Symposium, a celebration of the Fields Medal winner. Fields Medals are awarded every 4 years, and the medalists for 2022 are going to be announced in a few days in Helsinki. We span the entire spectrum of fundamental, applied, and industry-facing research. This series, What the Numbers Say, began during the COVID-19 pandemic to help the public make sense of the mathematics behind the modeling they started seeing every day. We wanted people to have a chance to ask questions directly to the people who were on the front lines of the pandemic effort, from clinicians to mathematical modelers and epidemiologists. We had an overwhelming response, with thousands of people tuning in and viewing our COVID-related events. I encourage you to check out some of the past videos, which are on our website and YouTube channel. As the world turns, so do the many new problems that inevitably arise, the latest being inflation. For the public, it can register at, well, the register. A rate like 7.7%, which is the most recent provided, can make numbers seem like the enemy, when it's really the other way around. Math is the way out and forward. We're here today to help decode some of the mathematics behind the decision-making process at the federal level and provide a bit of under-the-hood insights into how that could eventually translate into your personal finances. This is just one of the many questions we will be tackling this afternoon as our panelists address your questions about the math behind the headlines. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Dr. Louis-Philippe Rochon is full professor of economics at Laurentian University, Canada, where he has been teaching since 2004. Before that, he taught at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. He's currently editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy. He is the founder and past editor, now emeritus, of the Review of Keynesian Economics. He is the author of over 150 articles in peer-reviewed journals and books, and has written or edited close to 40 books. He has been a guest editor for the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, the International Journal of Pluralism and Economics Education, the European Journal of Economic and Social Systems, and the International Journal of Political Economy. He has been a visiting professor in Australia, as well as at 4 different universities in France, in Italy, Spain, Brazil, Mexico, Poland, and South Africa. And he has further lectured in China, Colombia, Ecuador, Italy, Japan, Kyrgyzstan, and Peru. Louis-Philippe, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Deirdre, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And wherever you are in the world, welcome. Welcome to what promises to be a very interesting debate today with three experts in their fields of mathematics or economics. I'm happy to lead today's discussion, which gives the public an opportunity to ask questions directly to the experts we often see quoted in the news. Today, we have a truly impressive group. Our first speaker from the University of Toronto is Dr. Louis Seco. He is a director of Risk Lab, a global-based laboratory headquartered in Toronto that conducts research in financial risk management. He's also president and CEO of Sigma Analysis and Management Limited. He is currently the director of the Mathematical Finance Program at the University of Toronto. In July 2019, the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences announced the appointment of Dr. Luis Sico as director of the Fields Center for Quantitative Analysis and Modeling through to July 2020. Our second speaker from Toronto Metropolitan University, or formerly known as Ryerson University, is Dr. Amy Peng. She is the inaugural Associate Dean of Innovation in Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Arts. Prior to that, she was Associate Professor in the Department of Economics since 2010, and she was Interim Chair in the Department of History in 2021, Interim Chair in the Department of Criminology between 1919 and 2020, an undergraduate program director for international economics and finance and the economics and management science programs. She recently contributed an article in The Walrus on inflation in Canada. And finally, our third expert speaker tonight is Professor Mario Sequereccia from the University of Ottawa. He has been there since 1978. He is now retired. He has authored or co-authored or co-edited a dozen books or monographs, over 40 special issues of journals, and has published over 125 articles or chapters of books. He's the editor of the International Journal of Political Economy. His principal research interests are in the areas of monetary economics and macroeconomics, history of economic thought and methodology, labor economics, and Canadian economics history. Since 2017, he received 3 distinguished recognitions for his work. Principally in 2017, he received the Senate of Canada Sesquicentennial Medal in commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Canadian Senate in 1867. So today's subject is inflation. It's in the news everywhere, and everywhere Canadians see it and we feel it. Inflation is now at a near 40-year high at 7.7. Canadians feel anxious about their finances, especially with interest rates on the way up. Indeed, around the world, central banks are raising interest rates, and some would say aggressively, in an effort to bring inflation back down to target around 2%. But is this the right policy? Is this the kind of inflation that responds well to monetary policy? In other words, is monetary policy efficient at the moment? And these are some of the questions that we'll be asking our panelists. Finally, do we need to engineer a recession in order to bring inflation down? So we are lucky to have 3 great experts in this field, and we're going to begin with a very easy question to ease into the discussion. The first question is addressed to all 3. You may or may not want to answer it all. I'm assuming there'll be some overlap, but how is inflation at 7.7? How is inflation calculated? Let's start with Louis.
Okay, so I should say that the 7.7, the number of inflation which is quoted, and no one knows this better than Amy or Mario, okay? But what I want to say is that it comes from a very simple formula, and it's very important that the what goes into the calculation of that number has to be very simple. So in other words, it's you shouldn't read too much into that. A lot of people spend a lot of their time trying to understand the constituent numbers that go into that. Okay, but that number is something which is the result of a very simple formula, and it has to be done that way. Maybe Amy can tell us more about that.
Well, first of all, I want to take the opportunity to thank the Fields Institute for inviting me to this virtual town hall. After hearing the introduction, thank you, Louis Philippe, and I'm very honored to be among the panelists, and they are all amazing mathematicians and economists. To answer the question, how inflation is calculated. So the inflation actually, like Luke said, is a very simple formula. It measures the annual rate of change in the price index of usually a fixed market basket of goods that we usually consume. The most common used index is called consumer price index. It represents changing prices as experienced by Canadian, or in Canadian setting would be by Canadian consumers. It measures price change by comparing through time the cost of a fixed basket of goods and services. So consumer price index basket divided into, I think in here, Canada is like 8 categories, that's including food, shelter, household operations, furnishing, equipment, clothes, footwear, recreational, transportation, education cost, alcoholic beverage, tobacco, cannabis, all of those things. I think it's over 300 items. So I also want to emphasize that this type of index is actually a weighted average, right? So we calculated a weighted average of all of the items listed. So the question usually comes through is how the weight are determined. So the weight are usually determined or adjusted based on some kind of spending pattern changes over the years. So I think in last month, so StatsCan updated the weight again. So that is usually based on some type of survey. So like a household final consumption expenditure survey or survey of household spendings. So when inflation is 7.7%, that means the consumer price index has changed or increased by 7.7%. compare with the same time, which is May of 2021. So that's just like the simple concept of how inflation is calculated. Mario?
Mario, do you have anything to add?
Well, not really much. I mean, I completely agree in terms of the actual calculation. However, I should mention that it used to be when they did these surveys of household spending, it used to be revised something like every 10 years. When I was a student in the 1970s, here in late 60s, early 70s, it used to be every 10 years. And now instead it's every 2 years. So they revised that basket in order to get a better representation of what is actually going on there from year to year in terms of what is a standard basket for a representative household in Canada. And it's a representative household, not only within a certain income range, but also, very importantly, it's metropolitan areas. Okay, so if you're in a rural community, you may not be actually well represented in that kind of index. Okay, and also the items, actually, I was looking at that. It used to be, we used to have something like, I think, if I remember correctly, in the sense, something like 400 items or so. Now it's actually a lot more, and it's a lot more complicated, the whole thing, actually. It contains something like 645, not product classes. And it's a very complex thing what they do there in terms of the specificity, because they have to compare across regions, across space, and also across time here. And that's an important thing, again, in terms of how it represents specific households, because of those items as they are themselves perhaps changing over time, which is another problem. Okay, but sorry. Yes.
Thank you. I just want to add to that. Of course, you mentioned the basket of goods, but this inflation is driven by a very small number of items: gas, rents, and etc. So it's a very different sort of. I'm not sure what the mathematics of the numbers behind those are saying. Maybe someone can shed some light, Mario.
Louis-Philippe, if you look at them, I'll just give you 2 categories for the last month here, from the April to May category, for instance. Clothing and footwear went up by 2.2%, while in the case of gasoline, it went up by 48%, okay, over the year, so on an annual basis. So that gives you a good idea of how different it is. In fact, there might even be prices falling, believe it or not, but it would be such a minor component. Okay, but for sure, there are prices that are barely rising or are within the 2% range that the Bank of Canada would like to see prices growing at. But others are, of course, rising, big times here. And the big one is the oil prices, which literally takes us back to the 1970s and early 80s when these oil prices were also following a similar pattern.
Amy, do you have anything to add?
Just to add to it, it is very true. So across those items, there's great deal of variations. So clearly, in May, particularly, we know the crude oil price has increased significantly due to, the Ukraine war. It's 110, last time I checked, like dollars per barrel, which is, just put in perspective on monthly growth, is actually 12% in this month. Okay, and compare to April, which is from March to April, is actually declined 0.7%. But then from April to May was 12% increases. And that really capturing why, there is significant impact on, because, crude oil, gasoline price impact variety of the items in the fixed basket. So I think people are panicking or worried about it because a lot of the things are essentials, groceries, for example, transportations, travel cost. So I read the Star a few days ago. They say in Ontario alone, the travel cost compared with last year has gone up by 56%. So that's where people feel it, right? So it's daily essentials. Why has it gone up so much? So that's partially the 7.7. Should we worry about it? And then we look at different categories at different items. I think people feel the impact, or average household feel the impact is really because it is about our essentials.
Thank you. Louis, anything to add?
One thing, which is a little bit of a historical memory. 2008. 14 years ago, okay, when the financial crisis hit, when interest rates became negative, the fear back then was that inflation was going to jump up immediately. It didn't. In fact, 14 years of inflation, not only below targets, actually inflation that was considered to be too low for a lot of the spending that was done to get out of the crisis. So of 2008. And now, so we're at 7.7. Essentially, what we wanted to happen 14 years ago is happening now. Okay, so that's a little bit. And the second thing is 7.7 is a high number, but what's even higher is the rate of change. Inflation was very low just a few months ago. Okay, how fast it came up is, I think, in my opinion, something which is, I'm not trying to scare anybody. This is not about scaring. We just want to understand the numbers, right? What do the numbers say? And what I think is remarkable in this case is how fast it has grown over the last few weeks.
Thank you. Louis, I don't want to embarrass you, but as a mathematician, you said you had one thing to say, and then you said two things.
Oh, I thought that's it too.
So, listen, I want to touch on something that's been in the news a lot. Robert Reich in the US, the Economic Policy Institute in the US, here the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, David McDonald, they've all touched about profit inflation, corporations profiteering from the confusion, raising prices in order to make higher profits, what's been called profit inflation. Does anyone have anything to say? I'm assuming, Mario, you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is in fact, this is a big debate going on right now. In the US, I just saw, what was it, about a week ago, a study done by the Roosevelt Institute that looked at this kind of what sometimes is referred to as markup inflation, which could be literally an opportunistic attempt to take advantage, of the confusion almost going on there. And you're going to see, I don't know, your grocery store or whatever, they're raising prices there, even though they're not facing such higher costs. I mean, in fact, I should mention that, it's very important to take note of this, which is that while inflation was 7.7%, meaning the CPI there, the Consumer Price Index, went up by 7.7% during April and May, the wages in Canada were growing at less than 4%, at 3.9, if I remember, 8 or 9, I can't remember exactly right now, that I looked at. And so what's going on here, of course, is that wages are starting to creep up a bit, but most of what is actually going on there has nothing to do with wages, clearly. And it has to do with either, yes, in the case of transport costs, is obvious if you see a skyrocketing, gasoline price, let's say. But there are a lot of other prices that are less clear as to where it's coming from. And there's been a lot of studies on that right now over the last year, trying to show that already in 2021, that, if you look at it in terms of profits, of corporate profits and all that, they've skyrocketed. But also if you look at it in terms of the price cost ratios, unit cost ratios, they are widening. Okay. And that is a fairly ubiquitous kind of phenomenon. Okay. In the United States, at least from the studies that I've looked at right now. Okay. So yes, there is a kind of marking up going on here that is of a cost push nature. It's not from wages, because we normally think that, it's because of wage growth that you're going to get, that filtered into prices ultimately for given markups, if you wish. Okay. But what has been happening over the last year has been more than that. Certainly it hasn't been through wages very much, but through other types of, in this case, not just from costs, which is obvious, so other costs like oil and so on, but also because of, as I said, these markups that have gone really quite a, significant amount. And as I said, there's a lot of discussion about that right now.
Thank you, Mario. Louis, you have a comment.
Yes. And it's a thought. Okay. And something we have experienced during COVID is the breakdown of supply chains. And manufacturers have had tremendous difficulties getting parts. And this disruption in the supply chains has not been priced in. If you're a supplier and you know that your part is holding, 10,000 vehicles hostage, what are you going to do? I think this goes a little bit to what Mario was saying. So it's not about blaming the fact that going back to my previous comment of 2008, the fact that inflation didn't occur despite the fact that we had negative interest rates is supply chains were extremely efficient and there was a lot of competition. Supply chains have broken down, and now the cost of doing things is much higher, right? As the supply chains are being, re-engineered. I don't know that this has anything to do with this. As I said, the world economy is very complicated, and this inflation number is a very simple number, right? So it's just a thought that if we want to understand what is happening, that I'm sure has some element in contributing to what's happening today.
Thank you. Listen, from the chat, we have a question from Kuram Makudumi. And, there was a time where even the Bank of Canada was saying that inflation was temporary. And it turns out it's not. This was maybe a year ago was the official line of the Bank of Canada. And then on top of that, the Bank of Canada raising rates 3 times, the Fed as well. Why is inflation not temporary, and why does it keep going up? Amy.
All right. So if you open Bank of Canada's website, the first thing they say is the main objective of the monetary policy is to preserve the value of money by keeping inflation low and stable. So the central bank only have one instrument here, that is the policy interest rate, which is a form of short-term interest rate. So one key policy interest rate changes, so all interest rate in our economy get affected. So all make adjustments. So we have seen this as key policy rate changes. So our prime rate has gone up to 3.7%. Our mortgage, a 5-year fixed mortgage rate had gone up to about 4.6%. So we're expecting another 75 basis point increases in July, which a lot of forecasting or the banks had released, the mortgage rate or fixed rate expect to go up to 5%. So for the monetary policy to work, it relies on a transmission mechanism. This is something, we teach our first-year students. Explains how interest rate affecting our decision on saving and spending. So as interest rate increases, the opportunity cost of money increases. So expecting all of us or individuals, if we are rational beings, behave rationally, then we'll save money, save more and spending less because the costs are going higher and higher. But there are factors may affecting the transmission mechanism. Number one, I think, well, there are two really obvious ones, and then the third one, we can discuss this a little bit. Number one is inflation, like currently can becomes entrenched in a way in when it fits itself, like, price rises because other prices are rising. And also labor compensations may go up. It's actually has gone up last year a little bit, up, well, compared with 2020 and 2021, it's gone up a little bit, then falling down a little bit in 2022, okay? Bank of Canada, or central bank, also claims that there is a policy lag of 6 to 8 quarters, which means from the policy rate changes, okay, to its full impact on the economy, it's gonna take 6 to 8 quarters. So even though we're changing the rate now, but we're not gonna see the full impact until next year. That's pretty much what they claim. The last one is, will people behave rationally, cut spending and save more as interest rate goes up? So number one, we can think about from the basics. So many things we talk about, the price has gone up, those are essentials. So we're economists or not economists, everybody understand not all of the goods and services subject to, the spending on them subject to, the same level of price changes. In economics, it's called demand elasticity. So give you some example, okay? Airline travel, so the elasticity is 0.1, okay? Gasoline, 0.5. Okay, natural gas, we use on residential, 0.5, fish or meat, 0.5. Anything less than 1, we call them inelastic or demand inelastic. What this means that those products that we use on a daily basis, they're really not sensitive or insensitive to price changes. Even though price increases, but we have to use them anyway. So therefore, the spending on those is not going to decrease significantly, okay? In addition, we know when economy come out of a lockdown, many type of restrictions, travel restrictions everywhere, regional restrictions everywhere, service industry, well, the whole in Canada, I think everywhere, okay, just start to recover a little bit. And with the strong performance of the labor market, we saw, unemployment rate is around 5.6% in Ontario, around 5% nationwide. So we're expecting the demand side, so the spending side for goods and services may continue to grow, okay? So especially, not everybody have a really tight credit constraint. So which means when people want to spend money, they can actually borrow as well to spending the money, which explaining why last year, even we call it a pandemic induced recession, but we still have a relatively hot housing market.
Thank you, Amy. Now, but let me just comment on that. You mentioned people reducing consumption and all of that, but what's driving inflation right now are not these demand-sensitive products. So raising interest rates by 75 basis points or whatever won't solve the war in Ukraine. They won't solve the bottlenecks. They won't solve. So from where I'm standing, monetary policy in this very moment is probably ineffective. And they're probably raising interest rates in order to save face. I know that they've been criticized a lot for being slow on the trigger. I wonder if Mario or Luis have any comments on that.
Yes, I do. Look, you're absolutely right that in an environment where it's basically supply side kind of effect here, price changes that are going on right now, raising interest rates will not do very much. What they're trying to do, though, is, and that's where it is a problem, is that it will not much impact on the inflation rate, which is really, a lot of that is almost internationally determined, not completely, obviously. There is stuff that is domestic here too. Now, housing prices are a good example. But when it comes to oil prices, for instance, we know perfectly well that this is not going to happen no matter what Canada does or the Bank of Canada does in terms of raising interest rates. However, what they're trying to do is something else, which is that it will create unemployment problems. You'll create more recessionary kind of environment in place here. And by so doing, what you want to do is stop wage growth, especially, from trying to catch up with this inflation. Okay. Now, is this the right way of doing things? I'm one of those who has preached over the years, literally, okay, that you don't want to raise the income of one group here, because remember, interest is not just a cost, it's also an income for certain people. You're raising the income of one group in order to kind of compress or control the income growth of another group. And to me, that is a terribly bad way of dealing with a problem which should be dealt with, I think, differently in this case, through, I would call, a more cooperative kind of arrangement here, rather than through what I would see as a more adversarial kind of way of dealing with it.
Yeah, there was the comments of the governor of the Bank of England a few months ago warning workers in the UK not to be greedy and ask for higher wage gains. Luis, anything to add?
Yes, I mean, this is a worldwide effect. So whatever you do in a country, especially a tiny country like Canada, is probably not going to have very much of an impact. So that's one thing. The other thing is, as Mario was saying, I completely agree with everything that Mario said. Okay, what this may do, increasing rates, it may create another dynamic that has nothing to do with the cause of the inflation that we see now, and create another one that may counteract. But again, the inflation number is a very simple number that in no way has any way to tell us what's happening really with all of the variables that go into it. Okay, so if we care about inflation, I think there's a room for other types of measures. I don't think the monetary policy is going to be, it hasn't been effective in the last 14 years. I don't think it's going to be effective going forward.
I agree. Let me turn to a question from the chat that was asked about shrinkflation. And we've seen this in the news lately. He gives an example of buying cornflakes. The box was 20% smaller, but the price was the same. This is sort of a hidden inflation. Let's go to Amy for a quick comment on that. How widespread is shrinkflation, or is this something that Canadians should be worried about?
Well, one thing we know, that's one way of business are cutting cost without, seems very obvious, right? So I'm pretty sure the Big Mac today is very different from the size of Big Mac quite a few years ago. So should consumer be concerned about it? I think all of us concerned about everyday daily essentials. So give you a good example. I have a household of 6. I have my parents, 2 kids, my husband, are 6 of us. I did notice the significant increases in my grocery bills, like from $300-400 a month, maybe half a year ago, to $600-700. I could not actually hold it. For me, it was actually did feel the significant increases. And then I also heard a lot of my friends when we're going out to eat and also complain about, yes, the economy start to open. We're back to restaurant. The restaurant are full, but the service as well as the food are not as good as before, right? So we heard about this as well. So there's ways where business thinking about cutting cost without seems too obvious. Maybe, well, we call them shrinkflation or type of inflation. We weren't, it may not seem too obvious, but it does impact, our daily expenses, especially, on all of the essentials that we're spending on.
Thank you. Mario.
Could I just add one little thing about this, which is that, yeah, there is shrinkflation, quote unquote, going on there for sure. But Statistics Canada, through its measure, ought to be adjusting for that. Okay, ought to be, I say here, meaning that they're supposed to price it on a per unit. So if you have a box of cornflakes is now 20% less, or God knows what it is, nowadays, in actual practice, they ought to be adjusting for that change in quantity there, in a sense there. Right. Now, do they actually do that? Well, God knows. This is not, I have no knowledge of that. But also, it's the same kind of problem. Remember, much of the concern historically about the price index is the fact that we do not adjust well for quality changes. And that goes both ways, I would say here. Like if we look at the shrinkflation problem right now, okay? In other words, maybe they're not shrinking the cars, but maybe they're changing something in there that is gonna give you something less, that is actually not better quality, but worse quality. And these are the sorts of things that are very difficult to adjust for and measure.
Thank you. Amy, quick reply.
Just quick comments. So the consumer index does have two type of bias minimum. So the one I see, one we can call them substitution bias. That is, consumer may end up, especially if we think a recession is coming, then we might substitute cheaper product for, a cheaper brand, let's say cheaper brand, compared with the brand you regularly consume. So I don't think it's just for that. And then is a new brand. So we know there's new brand coming out every day, repackaging coming out every day. I do not think they adjust that either. So there is two different kind of bias that automatically in the consumer price index aggregate calculations.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on to a next question. This is for Mario. So economists distinguish between a discontinuous jump in prices and a continued or sustained percentage change in prices. The first one is not considered inflation, while the second one is considered inflation. Can you comment on that, Mario, please?
Yes, thank you. Well, it's obvious that if you buy let's say a pack of potatoes that has gone up in price from, let's say, $1 to $2, okay, then what we see here is a discontinuous jump, if you want to call it that, okay, in the price of that product. And that's fine. I mean, that happens all the time. We have these kind of ups and downs, literally, in a dynamic setting. But that is not an inflation. What becomes an inflation is two things. One is that it's fairly broad-based. It's not just going to be potatoes here. It's going to be a lot of commodities prices going up. And secondly, of course, it tends to be continuous. Now, in terms of the language of math, it's like a discrete change versus a continuous kind of change here going on. When it's sustained and it's continuous over time, for those of you that have studied, I don't know, whatever, calculus or something, a differential, equation type of modeling, that tends to be what we mean by inflation. And all the language of economists normally, when it comes to macroeconomic issues, has to do with inflation and not just a price level change. Okay, so in that sense, that's important.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything to add quickly? Thank you. So this next question will start with Louis. So this level of inflation is the same as in 1983, a period of high inflation on the heels of the oil crisis in 1979. We have high oil prices today as well. But is inflation the same as in the 1980s?
Oh, very different. And it's a very good question. So many things are different now than they were before. So I'll start with the impact of oil. The oil crisis of the 70s did have a spillover effect. It took 4 years or so for happening. Okay, here is taking 4 months. That's number one. Okay, and we're not even at the point of the oil embargo. So that analogy already doesn't work. Second, the world in 1983 was not as interconnected as it is now. Now we're in a very interconnected world, again, relying on supply chains that were very efficient. Now they're all broken down. It's all completely different. And this is, I don't think looking at what happened in 1983 is gonna help us in any way. That's number one. Number two, and this is maybe, again, going back to my previous theory, is there may be two things moving in parallel. Okay, so what are we worried about? Are we worried about inflation being 7.7, or are we worried about the increase in interest rates that makes all of us fear either mortgages going up or home prices going down? They're different things. They're different things, right? And maybe both are bad. Maybe we worry about both sides of that equation. Okay? And that's why I think what, again, I'm no politician. I'm a mathematician. I study numbers. I study formulas. I study graphs. Okay, I like graphs and videos even more. So what I think we need to do is understand exactly what's the cause of that and resolve the problems which are there, addressing the problems and not that just one number. My opinion.
Thank you. Mario, I know that I'm sure you have something to say about this comparison.
Oh, yeah. I think I do. For sure. There are similarities as well. I mean, oil prices is a big one. That is the thing that it seems to be moving at all right now, by the way. Okay, but not before. I mean, but there were indirectly kind of dislocations, the supply chain issues that arose even in the 70s in a sense, but it was of a different nature. You know, in fact, we're much closer to what was after the Second World War in some ways, you know, because then it was really supply chain problems and all that. And we also had big inflation in the late 1940s, by the way. Okay, so in that regard, there is some similarities to them more than the 1970s. Where there is a difference, I would argue, is in terms of how it impacts on certain groups right now. Just to give you an example, in the 1970s, wages were shooting up a great deal, even overshooting, some might say at the time, okay, and, to the inflation rate. And they had set up price and wage controls and all that during that era. However, okay, nowadays, you know, after the great moderation, and trade unions tend to be pretty weakened in comparison to what existed, you know, in the early 80s, let's say. Okay. Secondly, in the early 80s, the savings rates of households were quite high. There was not much household indebtedness. And if you start raising interest rates, let's say in the 1980s, the impact wouldn't have been so bad on certain households as it could be today in this extremely fragile kind of, you know, highly indebted society that exists. Okay, so in that regard, one should be a little more concerned about how you deal with this inflation rate once again. You know, is it the correct way by starting to jack up interest rates, having a kind of Volcker shock, as they called it then, you know, in the early 80s? Today, again, it could be a complete disaster, I think.
Yes. Amy, anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit more. I think I want to go back to where Luis talked about 2008. I do want to touch upon that a little bit as well. I think central bank do think monetary policy like a silver bullet, right? Should it one way or the other, it's going to work. I think that's the way they're thinking. I want to go back to 2008. The reason is I don't think we live in the same type of environment we're describing. Even consider in terms of even. Let's not talk about 2022 yet. Let's just go back and thinking about from 2008 to 2020, what the central bank has been doing. I think they're only doing one thing, that is monetary expansion, right? How much, should we care about inflation? One way is to think about how much monetary expansion, right, that leading to money growth that happened in our economy. Okay, so use US as example. So in 2008, right, before right before or at the start of the financial crisis. So money base, where US actually Federal Reserve Bank published their M1, which is cash in circulation in the economy, is $850 billion. Okay, which rose to $2 trillion in March 2010. Towards the end of the financial crisis. And then it doubled again to $4 trillion in 2014, okay, with various ways, which we call them now quantitative easing, which is purchasing of government bonds and spread to some corporate bonds as well. So think about it. So 2008 to 2014, grow from $850 billion in US to $4 trillion. And many of you are going to ask me, well, Luis had the same question. Why inflation didn't rise at the time, even with monetary expansion? Well, we can think about the crisis, in many ways was a credit crisis. The lending rate was low. There's money, but people are not really borrowing, and the banks are not effective lending it out either. As a fact, the deposit reserve ratio, the reserves in maintaining in all US banking system was high, was in the trillions of dollars. So in the effort, I remember, there was an effort of encouraging investment. So, they actually eliminated used to have a fractional reserve system, this reserve ratio, that was gone. Well, never happened, never existed in Canada. So similarly, in Canada, so Bank of Canada assets holding, let's just say through this round of pandemic, okay, jumped from $105 billion in March 2020 to $450 billion in December 2021. That's almost 4 times. Okay, most coming from banks purchasing a government bond and spread it to corporate bond. Okay, again, we mentioned about tens of negative supply shock as well. So I started to think maybe it's time to go back and look at the classical models. I mean, maybe there's monetary inflation because now we're not in the same scenario, right? So people are spending, people are overly borrowing. The national debt level is high. The debt to GDP ratio is growing. Household debt ratio is growing. Should this be, something to concern about? If this is the case, then we go back to think why this may not be a good time to significantly raise the interest rate, because we do worry about, people are heavily in debt. So, we live in Great Toronto area, we understood. So average detached home is way over $1 million. So if people are $1 million in debt, in mortgage, okay, translate monthly, every 1% increase in mortgage rate, it means $1,000 more in mortgage payment per month. Can people afford this now?
Thank you. Just a quick comment on monetary expansion and the monetary base and inflation. I don't think central banks talk in these terms anymore. I think it's a model that's been
abandoned. Yeah.
Well, not just abandoned, but discredited. Mario can certainly say a lot more about that. But the idea that inflation is somehow related to even fiscal, we hear that it's linked to fiscal spending and monetary expansion. I don't think inflation is linked to any of these things really, because I don't think we're at full employment, or, I think there's a lot of murkiness around what we're talking about full employment these days. So I don't know if any one of you, Luis or Mario, wants to comment on that or worth commenting on. Yes, Mario?
Just to make one thing very clear, which is that there's no direct link between, bank, quantitative easing in this case, let's say purchases in this case of whatever, securities by the central bank, and the inflation rate. I mean, there's absolutely, in fact, there's not even a link between that and bank lending, because the banks, as you know, and we have no reserve requirements in Canada since 1994, if I remember correctly. Hence, the idea that somehow by creating more reserves is going to get them to lend more, they don't need those reserves in the first place to lend. So there's no direct link there whatsoever. The only link there is through asset prices. There it does impact, because of course, if you have, if you're purchasing a lot of these financial assets, what it did during the crisis, it did that also during the financial crisis in the US in 2008, 2009, so on, was to maintain or support or sustain those asset prices from collapsing. In fact, they did it so well that those asset prices shot through the roof during 2020, literally. As you know, it went all through the various, think of it, spectrum of asset prices, including the stock market, when the real economy, the GDP was collapsing by 15% in March, April during that quarter. Asset prices were going up by 20%, which is a complete aberration otherwise, except for the fact that it was being sustained through these asset purchases by the central bank. Now, there were some good reasons why they wanted to sustain them, but not necessarily to raise them to such a degree, which I think was again, highly problematic. But to suggest that that was the cause of inflation of product prices, well, that link is, to say the least, highly, highly tenuous, if it exists at all.
Luis, you were nodding a lot. Can you?
Yes, because this goes to, no, this is the fun part for me, okay? Because, so the situation is complex, there's no question about that. And everybody's looking at that one number. And like I said, I think that, look, it's the year 2022. We can do things better than that, okay? We can understand things better than that. We can, I think what we need is this is the mathematician in me. I think we need a new model where we have more clarity as to what exactly is happening. That number 7.7 will be very different. It was caused by a completely different situation, right? And it's perhaps the time for a new effort to get some more clarity into that. The decision makers, I'm sure they know, and the professional experts in finance, I'm sure they know, and they're because they have a lot more information than the public and us. But I think the time probably has come for some more information-loaded way of making a picture of where inflation is.
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because Mario earlier referred to StatsCan should take into consideration the shrinkflation. There's a comment or question here by Kumar, and he says that the indicators we are talking about were defined a long time ago and are quite coarse. Would you suggest alternative, more modern quantitative indicators to understand the dynamics of economic change?
Right. So if I'll say one comment, if you fly an airplane with the models that are used to calculate inflation, that plane would not even take off the ground. So
I like that analogy. Amy, do you have anything?
But at the same time, the simple number normally that's what people rely on. So you still have to come down to say, whenever we talk about the state of the economy, we talk about real GDP growth, unemployment, inflation. Those are assuming, those are the numbers that we're reporting on monthly or quarterly basis, those are the number people could understood. I understand there's a reason to change them at the same time, or the underlying model maybe. But at the same time, we still need the simple numbers in order to actually, inform the public.
I agree, but look at a weather forecast, right? Imagine you do a weather forecast without the wind chill factor. Then it means nothing. Right?
But most people don't think about the underlying model at all.
Right. So, but maybe we should introduce the wind chill factor into the inflation number. No.
Okay.
I think Mario would probably be in favor of that. I don't know.
I'm in favor of broader understanding of the CPI encapsulates a specific group of items that are good or bad. You cannot criticize what is a definition almost, that is there, that can be used in a certain way or may not be used in that way. And how we interpret it is important. But as everybody knows, in actual fact, not only do we look at various categories of the CPI, they're used to produce, and I think it's still possible, I'm not sure what they do at Stats Canada anymore at that level, but they used to produce different income group level effects, how they're impacted by prices. So for instance, if you're in the, let's say 30,000 and below category of income today, what in the world do you buy is not the same as what is included in that CPI. Okay, it doesn't pertain to you very much, except for certain food products or whatever there, or rent or whatever. Okay, while for somebody who's earning 150,000, he might be more interested in whatever there, the housing prices or something to speculate on even. Okay, those pertain to different categories of people, but we don't do that. We just encapsulate everything with into that CPI, and we have policy framed by monetary, in this case, policy framed on the basis of that peculiar CPI change, which as I would argue here, it could be useful for certain purposes, but it may not be useful for other purposes. And to put everything in one basket, call that CPI, again, might be problematic. So I don't disagree with Kumar, what he raised as problem there in terms of looking at other indicators. There are possible indicators out there that might be more appropriate for the, it's not good for all seasons. That's all I would say.
Yeah. Thank you. So it's time to wrap up, and I'm going to wrap up with one final question. We started with a simple question. We're going to end with a difficult question. When is inflation going to come down? Does anyone want to have a guess with your Harry Potter crystal ball? Or when is inflation going to come down in Canada?
Well, can we predict when the war in Ukraine will end, for instance? Or will it end as the president suggested that they should end it by the end of the year, before winter? Or we may end up with a nuclear war even, God knows. It's hard to predict any of this stuff, okay? So do we have a crystal ball on that? I don't think so, because a lot of that is tied to all these changes going on in the world economy right now, the kind of tremendous dislocations, supply chain problems. It's like furniture that we import from Asia, let's say, that have a lot of problems right now in getting them over. And that is a supply chain problem that nobody predicted a year ago, even. It would have been so bad a year later, okay? But how could we know certain things? Yeah, I would be willing to bet that by next year, that supply chain problem might be over here about furniture. But about the war, God forbid, I don't know.
I would say that I can only predict one thing, which is whatever prediction I give will be wrong.
The last word to Amy.
I think Mario and Luis said it very well. So I think it is also difficult to predict, because there's a lot of political forces right now, and we live in so much uncertainty. So one thing I know is rapid change of the price create uncertainty, right? So uncertainty is where people don't know where to go. And then we rely on government, Bank of Canada, central bank to make a decision. But then what if the decision is wrong? We don't really know until it unravels in the future. So right now it's very difficult to see which direction it's going to go. Only thing we know it's caused a lot of speculations. Mario talked about asset pricing. There's a lot of that going on. Housing market, anything related to capital movement and financial market, investment. There's tons of uncertainty out there. Okay, we can hope the best. I hope the war ends soon. If we have a crystal ball, if we can make one wish, that's what I would wish for, the war to end.
Well, let me finish. You mentioned uncertainty, and I asked about when will inflation come down. Let me finish with the quote by Keynes: "We simply do not know." Thank you to the panelists, Luis Seco, Mario Siqueirecha, Amy Peng. Thank you. Thank you to the Fields Institute. This was a very entertaining webinar. I could have gone on I had a lot more questions, but we only had an hour. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.